as he looked up at me, I pulled the gun up and fired. And I missed. I wasn't used to this revolver.
Killers on death row often leave behind last words that cut to the core, some filled with remorse, others laced with defiance, and a few hauntingly silent. These moments lay bare the weight of their crimes, while exposing deep flaws in the justice system. But what were the final, chilling words of the youngest killers to ever face execution?
So it's like that. Guys get complacent and they forget where they are. But I always know I was on death row. I know the reality of it.
Napoleon Beazley. Napoleon Beazley, a 17-year-old from Grapeland, Texas, shocked the nation with his senseless and brutal crime. On April 19, 1994, he and two friends, Cedric and Donald Coleman, targeted John Ludig, a prominent businessman, outside his home. Beazley's motive was to steal Ludig's Mercedes-Benz, but the situation escalated into a deadly carjacking. Beazley shot Ludig twice in the head, killing him instantly, and attempted to shoot Ludig's wife, Bobby. She narrowly survived by pretending to be dead. The crime devastated the Ludig family and sent shockwaves through their affluent Tyler, Texas community. Investigators quickly connected Beazley to the crime. His accomplices, the Coleman brothers, testified against him in exchange for 40-year prison sentences. Beazley, as the shooter, faced a much graver consequence. The case gained additional notoriety because John Ludig was the father of federal judge J. Michael Ludig, a connection that raised questions about fairness and undue influence during the legal process. Napoleon Beazley's trial was marked by controversy from the start. Despite his young age, he was tried as an adult in a system criticized for its harsh treatment of juvenile offenders. An all-white jury deliberated his fate, and many pointed out racial biases in the proceedings. Beazley's court-appointed attorneys were inexperienced and underprepared, leading to further criticism about whether he received a fair defense. During the trial, Beazley admitted his guilt and expressed regret for his actions. However, the prosecution emphasized the senseless brutality of the crime. The jury convicted him of capital murder and sentenced him to death. His age, coupled with the racial disparities in the justice system, became focal points for his defense team during appeals. Over the next 8 years, Beazley's lawyers filed multiple appeals, arguing that his sentence violated evolving standards of decency and fairness. They highlighted his immaturity at the time of the crime, his clean prior record, and his ability to reform. Despite these efforts, the courts upheld his death sentence. On May 28, 2002, at 25 years old, Napoleon Beazley was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. His execution was the 11th in the state that year. In the days leading up to his death, activists, religious leaders, and human rights organizations like Amnesty International were rallied to spare his life. They argued that executing someone for a crime committed at 17 violated international norms and moral standards. Beazley spent his final hours reflecting on his actions and the system that led him to this moment. He was allowed to meet with his family and clergy before being escorted to the execution chamber. Witnesses described his demeanor as calm and composed, a stark contrast to the young man who committed the crime years earlier. "The act I committed was senseless, but the person who committed it is no longer here. I am saddened by what is happening here tonight. I am disappointed in a system that is supposed to protect and uphold what is just and right, but can be just as flawed as I was." His words reflected both regret for his actions and criticism of the justice system. Many witnesses noted the maturity and depth of his statement, which stood in stark contrast to the impulsive teenager who took John Ludig's life. The execution of Napoleon Beazley sparked widespread debate about the juvenile death penalty. Advocates argued that his case illustrated the need for more leniency and rehabilitation opportunities for young offenders. Opponents of the death penalty pointed to Beazley's remorse and personal growth as evidence that he could have been reformed. The Ludig family, meanwhile, expressed relief that justice had been served, but remained deeply affected by the loss of their loved one. John Ludig's widow, Bobby, later described the emotional toll of the crime and the trial, noting that no punishment could undo the tragedy. Beazley's execution came just 3 years before the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark decision in Roper v. Simmons, 2005, which abolished the death penalty for crimes committed by minors. His case became a symbol of the movement to end juvenile executions, and his story continues to be cited in discussions about criminal justice reform.
When I fired the gun, he was only about 1.5 feet, 2 feet away from me. and he was holding up some kind of a coat and was bent down.
Sean Sellers. Sean Sellers, a teenager from Oklahoma, committed a series of horrific murders that shocked the nation and sparked debates about juvenile justice and the death penalty. Born on May 18, 1969, Sean's troubled upbringing and fascination with dark forces led to a tragic spiral of violence. At the age of 16, Sean killed 3 people in a series of shocking crimes. His first murder occurred on September 8, 1985, when he fatally shot Robert Bauer, a convenience store clerk, during a robbery in Oklahoma City. Sellers later claimed that the murder was not premeditated and occurred in a moment of rage after Bauer refused to sell him beer. 6 months later, Sean escalated his violence in an unthinkable act. He killed his mother, Vonda Sellers, and stepfather, Paul Bellafato, while they slept. Using a .44 Magnum pistol, Sean shot Paul first and then turned the gun on his mother, shooting her in the face. Sean's reasoning for killing his parents was chilling. He claimed he was angry with them for enforcing strict household rules and interfering with his lifestyle. Later, he would claim that he was under the influence of Satanism at the time, even going so far as to blame the murders on a demon named Izura that he believed had possessed him. Sean Sellers' trial was one of the most controversial in U.S. history, as he was one of the youngest offenders ever sentenced to death. His defense team argued that Sean was mentally ill and that his actions were the result of his belief in Satanism and demonic possession. Psychological evaluations revealed that Sean suffered from multiple personality disorder and severe depression. He had a history of self-destructive behavior, including dabbling in satanic rituals and writing dark, disturbing poetry. His attorneys argued that Sean's mental state at the time of the crimes should exempt him from the death penalty. The prosecution, however, painted Sean as a cold-blooded killer who had shown no remorse for his actions. They emphasized the premeditated nature of his crimes, particularly the murders of his parents, which he had carried out methodically. Sean's defense team also raised concerns about his young age and the role of his unstable upbringing in shaping his behavior. Despite these arguments, the jury found him guilty of all 3 murders and sentenced him to death. At the time of his sentencing, Sean Sellers was just 17 years old, making him the youngest person on Oklahoma's death row. Sean Sellers spent over a decade on death row, during which he underwent a significant transformation. He converted to Christianity and became a devout follower of the faith, claiming that he had been forgiven for his sins. Sean also became an advocate for prison ministry, sharing his story as a cautionary tale for others. In the years leading up to his execution, Sean expressed deep remorse for his actions. He wrote letters to the families of his victims, apologizing for the pain he had caused. Sean also worked with his attorneys and activists to campaign against the execution of juvenile offenders, arguing that his case demonstrated the potential for rehabilitation. Despite widespread public debate and numerous appeals, Sean's execution was carried out on February 4, 1999 at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. He was 29 years old at the time. Sean Sellers' final moments were marked by a calm acceptance of his fate and a heartfelt expression of faith. Before the lethal injection was administered, Sean addressed the witnesses saying, "Here I come, Father. I'm coming home." He then began to sing a hymn, "Set My Spirit Free," as the execution process began. Witnesses reported that his voice was steady and serene, a stark contrast to the chaotic and violent actions of his youth. The execution of Sean Sellers sparked fierce debates about the ethics of the death penalty, particularly for crimes committed by juveniles. Activists and organizations like Amnesty International condemned the execution, citing Sean's age at the time of his crimes and his mental health struggles. They argued that the justice system had failed to account for the complexities of his case, including his potential for rehabilitation. On the other hand, the families of his victims expressed relief that justice had finally been served. They emphasized the devastating impact of Sean's actions on their lives and argued that his execution was a necessary consequence of his crimes.
There will be a lot of turkey served over the next few days, but none may taste sweeter than the turkey served today.
Johnny Frank Garrett. Johnny Frank Garrett was just 17 years old.
We're assembled here today to witness the execution of Johnny Frank Garrett, sentenced to death by lethal injection,
when he was accused of one of the most brutal crimes in Amarillo, Texas. On October 31st, 1981, Sister Tadia Benz, a 76-year-old Catholic nun, was found raped and murdered in her home at the St. Francis Convent.
For the murder of Sister Tadia Benz. Have you got anything you want to say to us right now, son?
Sister Benz was discovered strangled and beaten, her body left in a horrifying state. Garrett lived across the street from the convent, and his connection to the crime came after police claimed to find evidence linking him to the scene. Despite his young age and troubled history, Garrett was charged with capital murder, a decision that would lead to a controversial trial and eventual execution. Garrett's trial remains one of the most debated in the history of the U.S. justice system. Prosecutors relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, including fingerprints and a supposed confession, though many argued these were obtained under dubious circumstances. Garrett had a troubled upbringing marked by severe abuse and neglect. He was reportedly subjected to physical and sexual abuse as a child, leaving him with significant mental health issues. Despite these factors, the court dismissed the role of his traumatic past and his diagnosed mental illnesses, including schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder. His defense argued that Garrett's mental state made him incapable of understanding the severity of his actions. They also pointed to flaws in the investigation, including missing evidence and allegations of police coercion. Garrett's attorneys claimed that he was pressured into making statements and that the confession was fabricated. The trial lasted only a few days, and the jury sentenced Garrett to death. This swift decision drew criticism, especially given his age at the time of the crime and the questions surrounding the fairness of the proceedings. After spending more than a decade on death row, Johnny Frank Garrett was executed by lethal injection on February 11, 1992, at the age of 28. His execution was widely covered by the media due to the controversies surrounding his case. In the years leading up to his execution, Garrett maintained his innocence, insisting that he had been wrongfully convicted. Advocacy groups and human rights organizations rallied behind his case, citing the lack of concrete evidence and his mental health issues as reasons to overturn his sentence. However, their efforts failed, and his appeals were denied. In his final moments, Garrett displayed a mixture of defiance and bitterness. When asked for his last words, he addressed his family and expressed gratitude for their support, saying, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me." However, his tone shifted dramatically as he turned to the rest of the world with a stark statement. "The rest of the world can kiss my..." Witnesses described Garrett's demeanor as unrepentant, and his last words shocked many in the execution chamber. For some, his defiance was a final assertion of his innocence. For others, it was a confirmation of his guilt and lack of remorse. Garrett's case sparked outrage both at home and abroad. Critics of the death penalty cited his execution as an example of systemic failures in the U.S. justice system. They highlighted the lack of thorough investigation, the dismissal of his mental health struggles, and the reliance on questionable evidence as critical flaws in his trial. Many human rights organizations argued that Garrett's case exemplified why juvenile offenders should not face the death penalty. His youth at the time of the crime, coupled with his history of abuse and mental illness, raised ethical concerns about his execution. On the other hand, supporters of the death penalty viewed Garrett's execution as justice for Sister Benz and her grieving community. They emphasized the brutality of the crime and the devastating impact it had on the convent and the local Catholic community.
Convicted murderer Brandon Bernard was put to death by lethal injection last night. It was the first execution.
Brandon Bernard was just 18 years old when he became involved in a horrific crime that would ultimately lead to his execution. In June 1999, Bernard and a group of friends, including Christopher Villalva, carried out the carjacking and double murder of Todd and Stacy Bagley, a young Christian couple from Texas. The group forced the Bagleys into the trunk of their car at gunpoint and drove around for hours, withdrawing money from the couple's accounts and attempting to pawn their belongings. Eventually, they stopped at a remote location where Villalva shot both Todd and Stacy in the head, killing Todd instantly. Stacy, still alive but gravely injured, was trapped in the car as Bernard set it on fire. Prosecutors argued that Bernard played a critical role in the crime by lighting the fire, which ultimately caused Stacy's death. Bernard's involvement in the grisly act placed him alongside Villalva as one of the principal offenders despite his claims that he acted under duress and fear of the older gang members. Brandon Bernard's trial raised serious questions about the fairness of sentencing a teenager to death. His defense team argued that Bernard's youth and lesser role in the murders should have been considered mitigating factors. During the trial, Bernard's attorneys failed to present key evidence that could have influenced the jury's decision. For example, experts later testified that Bernard's brain was still developing at the time of the crime, a factor that significantly impacts decision-making and impulse control. Additionally, his clean record before the crime and positive behavior in prison were not highlighted effectively. Despite these arguments, Bernard was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. His co-defendant, Christopher Villalva, was executed earlier in 2020, further intensifying public scrutiny of Bernard's case. On December 10, 2020, Brandon Bernard was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. His death marked one of the last federal executions carried out during a controversial push to reinstate capital punishment at the federal level. In his final moments, Bernard displayed deep remorse for his role in the crime. Addressing the Beazley family, he said, "I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I hope someday you find peace and can forgive me." Bernard also thanked his family and friends for their love and support, expressing regret that he couldn't undo the harm he had caused. Witnesses described his demeanor as calm and composed, with his last words reflecting the sincerity of his remorse. Despite his remorse and strong appeals from activists and legal experts, the execution proceeded as scheduled. Efforts to secure a last-minute stay of execution, including a clemency petition supported by high-profile figures such as Kim Kardashian, were ultimately unsuccessful. Brandon Bernard's execution sparked widespread outrage and reignited debates about the use of the death penalty, particularly for individuals who commit crimes as teenagers. Activists and legal scholars argued that his case exemplified the flaws in the justice system, pointing to the failure to adequately consider his age, role in the crime, and potential for rehabilitation. Bernard's case also drew attention to racial disparities in the application of the death penalty. As a black teenager sentenced to death for a crime where others with similar or greater involvement received lesser sentences, his story highlighted systemic inequities. The Beazley family, however, supported the execution, emphasizing the devastating loss of Todd and Stacy and the heinous nature of the crime. Their grief and calls for justice remained central to the case, underscoring the profound impact of the murders on the victims' loved ones. Douglas Christopher Thomas. Douglas Christopher Thomas, known as Chris Thomas, was just 17 years old when he committed a shocking double murder that would lead to his execution. On November 10, 1990, in Virginia, Thomas shot and killed J.B. and Kathy Wiseman, the parents of his 14-year-old girlfriend, Jessica Wiseman. The murders were the culmination of a tumultuous relationship between Thomas and Jessica, which Kathy and J.B. strongly disapproved of due to their daughter's young age and Thomas's influence. Jessica's parents had forbidden her from seeing him, which reportedly enraged both teenagers. In their desire to be together, they devised a plan to kill her parents. On the night of the crime, Thomas entered the Wiseman home with a shotgun. As J.B. and Kathy slept, he fired multiple fatal shots, leaving both parents dead. Afterward, Thomas and Jessica fled the scene, stealing the family car and some money. Authorities arrested the pair shortly after the murders, uncovering their plan and the chilling roles each played in the crime. Thomas's trial was highly controversial due to his age and the significant role Jessica played in orchestrating the murders. Prosecutors described Thomas as the primary offender, portraying him as a manipulative and dangerous young man who executed the crime without remorse. Thomas's defense argued that his actions were heavily influenced by Jessica, who had been the driving force behind the murders. They highlighted the immaturity and impulsiveness of Thomas's teenage brain, claiming he acted out of love and pressure from Jessica. However, the jury was unconvinced, especially after hearing Thomas's confession and the evidence linking him to the crime. Jessica, on the other hand, received a much lighter sentence. She was tried as a juvenile and served only 7 years in detention, a stark contrast to Thomas's fate. This disparity in sentencing sparked outrage, with critics claiming that Jessica's role had been downplayed due to her age and gender. Thomas was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, making him one of the youngest offenders on death row in the United States. His case drew significant attention from human rights organizations, which opposed the execution of juveniles and argued that his age should have been a mitigating factor. On January 10, 2000, at the age of 26, Douglas Christopher Thomas was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. His execution came amid growing international criticism of the United States for using the death penalty on individuals who committed crimes as juveniles. In his final moments, Thomas reflected on his fate and the justice system. When asked if he had any last words, he stated calmly, "Death is only the beginning." These words left a lasting impression on witnesses, encapsulating his acceptance of his fate and his belief in life beyond death. Throughout his time on death row, Thomas had expressed regret for his actions and acknowledged the pain he caused the Wiseman family. However, his remorse did little to sway public opinion or halt his execution. Advocacy groups continued to fight for clemency until the very end, arguing that Thomas had been a victim of a flawed justice system that failed to account for his youth and potential for rehabilitation. The execution of Douglas Christopher Thomas reignited debates about the ethics of sentencing minors to death. Critics argued that his age at the time of the crime, coupled with the significant influence Jessica had on his actions, should have warranted a lesser sentence. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, condemned the execution, citing international laws that prohibit capital punishment for crimes committed by individuals under 18. They called attention to the United States' isolation as one of the few nations still practicing juvenile executions. Supporters of the death penalty, however, pointed to the brutality of the crime and the need for justice for J.B. and Kathy Wiseman. For the victims' families, Thomas's execution marked the end of a decade-long legal battle and brought some sense of closure. Steve Edward Roach, a 17-year-old from Virginia, committed a crime that shocked his small community and ultimately led to his execution. On December 3, 1993, Roach killed 70-year-old Marianne Hughes during a robbery at her home. Roach, who knew Hughes, claimed he went to her house intending to ask for money but panicked when she refused. In his confession, Roach admitted to shooting Hughes with a handgun he had brought with him. After the shooting, he stole her car and purse in a desperate attempt to escape. The crime left the elderly woman's family and neighbors devastated, as Hughes was known as a kind and generous person who often helped others. Roach's troubled background came to light during the investigation. Raised in a dysfunctional household, he faced neglect and abuse from a young age. These hardships shaped his behavior and decision-making, leading to impulsive and reckless actions. Despite this, the severity of his crime left little room for leniency in the eyes of the law. Roach was quickly apprehended after the murder, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and he was caught driving Hughes's stolen car. During his trial, Roach pleaded guilty to capital murder, hoping that his honesty and cooperation would lead to a lighter sentence. The defense team emphasized Roach's young age and troubled upbringing, arguing that he lacked the emotional maturity to fully understand the consequences of his actions. A psychologist testified that Roach had poor impulse control and a history of acting out due to his chaotic environment. The defense also highlighted his remorse, as Roach repeatedly expressed regret for his crime and apologized to Hughes's family. Despite these arguments, the prosecution painted Roach as a dangerous individual who needed to be held accountable for his actions. The jury ultimately sentenced him to death, a decision that drew criticism from human rights advocates who believed juveniles should not face capital punishment. On January 13, 2000, Steve Edward Roach was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. He was 23 years old at the time, making him one of the youngest offenders executed in the United States. In his final moments, Roach displayed a sense of peace and acceptance. When asked if he had any last words, he recited Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." His calm demeanor and reference to faith left a profound impression on witnesses, many of whom were moved by his apparent remorse and spiritual reflection. Roach had spent his time on death row writing letters to troubled youths, urging them to avoid the path he had taken. He expressed deep regret for his actions and hoped that his story would serve as a warning to others. Despite his efforts to atone, his execution proceeded as scheduled, leaving his supporters disheartened and his critics divided. Steve Roach's execution sparked intense debates about the morality of sentencing juveniles to death. Advocates against the death penalty pointed to his age at the time of the crime, arguing that young offenders should be given opportunities for rehabilitation rather than facing the ultimate punishment. Organizations like Amnesty International condemned his execution, calling it a violation of international laws that prohibit capital punishment for crimes committed by minors. Supporters of the death penalty, however, emphasized the brutality of Roach's crime and the need for justice for Marianne Hughes and her family. They argued that his age did not excuse his actions and that the punishment fit the severity of the offense. The haunting nature of these cases lies in their final moments, where young offenders face their ultimate fate. Their last words offer a glimpse into their humanity, from regret and apology to defiance and indifference. These executions raise moral questions about punishing young offenders and whether justice or mercy should prevail. But what are your thoughts on these tragic cases? Let us know down below. And if you enjoyed these cases, then make sure to watch our next ones shown on screen.